Hello and welcome to the UK India Business Council and SKP Group's first presentation on conducting compliance investigations in India. Today is part one of our upcoming series, and our expert speaker, Sundar Narayanan from SKP Group, will be discussing the things you need to be aware of. Multinational corporations often receive concerns regarding compliance violations and other compliance-related issues. This series of recordings aim to bring in a guideline view on conducting compliance investigations in India. The recordings will cover aspects of conducting compliance investigations, approach towards investigations, and measures to be considered in determining culpability, amongst others. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to our speaker Sundar to begin his presentation.
Thanks, Becky. That's a good brief introduction. Welcome, audience. The context of our presentation is going to be conducting compliance investigation. Before we get on to the primary topic, I would like to just give some bit of overview. I'm Sundar, like Becky introduced. I handle investigations, corporate investigations and compliance investigations aimed at gathering evidences on misconduct and compliance exceptions. Overall, the theme of the webcast is going to be towards compliance investigations in India. As a first part of the series, we are focusing on things to be aware of from an Indian environment standpoint. Here, I will take you through 4 key aspects that we may want to understand overall. I just thought it would be a good point for us to start off with a broader view of certain brief aspects about India before we kickstart with specific presentation. Now, as we talk, the first few things that you may want to be aware of is India is a country with 2073 billion of the GDP, with a per capita of about $1,479. It has a huge population of 1.2 billion. And if I have to give you a contextual reference, the city of Mumbai has more population than the continent of Australia. So that's the contextual reference. So compliance as an issue becomes really important with the crowding population and the competitive landscape. And compliance is becoming more and more relevant in a country like India, which is one of the fastest growing economies in BRICS, primarily driven by 2 factors. One is because of global corporations having global regulation impact in India and evolving regulations for Indian corporations. That's the primary 2 factors that drive the compliance in India. So as we move to the next slide, we can actually look into the specific factors that we're going to see in today's presentation. We are covering 3 to 4 aspects in the presentation, focused on the whole theme of understanding compliance investigation environment in India. So the 4 key aspects are areas of compliance investigation in India, and the next aspect is about how the regulators, who are the regulators for the key compliances in India, the prominent evidence sources that one needs to consider while conducting investigations in India, and also what are the key considerations one may have to look at when they are conducting investigations in India. So these are the 4 key themes that we're going to run through in today's presentation. So before we start off with the first theme, one context that we need to be aware of is that India in this past 1 decade has had multiple levels of compliance issues, and the regulation and transparency maturity has significantly contributed to it. So when I say compliance issues, these compliance issues can be of multiple types. It can be an anti-corruption compliance issue, or it could be an issue of how you look at the competition commission issues, or it should be issues of market manipulation or market reputation related issues. Now, when we look at the contextual reference of these issues, because of in this past 1 decade, we've seen a number of instances wherein even political leaders have been charged on anti-corruption issues in India. And not just that, we've seen some of the landmark cases, like the case of Walmart, where there were certain indications or issues associated with bribery to public officials that was very broadly covered in the media, and it also had implications of challenges that are faced by foreign companies while operating in India. On the other side, when we look at Competition Commission of India, it is one of the most prominent regulator in India, which has been enforcing the competition matters very strictly. And we see very often, at least a month, a number of prosecutions or number of fines that being imposed by the Competition Commission of India on matters relating to competition violation. So some of the examples to look at is they had a widespread issue that they handled with regard to the cement price fixing cases in India, which resulted in fines of over 1,000 crores overall. This approximately was one of the top 10 fines that was imposed by CCI at an industry-wide level. Similarly, Coal India, one of the largest coal producers in India, was fined for limitations that were there in their supply packs with the third parties or suppliers, and they were fined about 500 crores for this. So that is how the Competition Commission is operating more actively. From a market regulation perspective, because there is a transparency demand and there is globalization impact, the markets are more active in tracking and protecting the interest of the investors, both domestic and foreign. Now, as we move on to the next slide, we will focus on key prominent types of compliance investigations that happens in India. When I say prominent types of compliance investigations, we are speaking about 6 key issues where we frequently see compliance investigations: anti-money laundering, anti-corruption, market manipulation, anti-competitive or antitrust practices, tax violations or accounting violations, and other regulatory violations. These composite a sizable chunk of the compliance investigations that happen in India. Anti-money laundering is primarily triggered with suspicious activity reporting that a banking channel does, and also triggered by multiple financial services businesses which does due diligences, customer due diligences prior to onboarding. Anti-corruption issues are coming up from bribery and corruption issues that are faced in different industries, and this involves both public and private sector briberies, and these investigations we see are also driven by international cooperation and regulations like UK BA or FCPA, as the case may be. Antitrust matters are more driven by the monopolization or the market share related issues. So in some instances, a particular business actually, if they take over or if they are in the mood for mergers and acquisition, there is a possibility the firm that with which they are attempting to merge makes the competition irrelevant or creates a monopoly in that market environment. So in those cases, there are investigations that are conducted by the regulator and also parallel investigations that are conducted or considered by corporations to avoid possible violations in this regard. Market manipulations, like I said, is primarily aimed at protecting the interest of the investors. We also have the other two areas, which is tax violations and accounting violations and other regulatory violations. Tax violations and accounting violations have gained a significant interest in the past decade, also driven by the political will of ensuring that the taxpayers' money is protected and the investors' interest is protected. For example, few years back, we had one of the largest accounting scandal, which is Satyam, a company in information technology industry had misreported its income, resulting in a significant loss of value for its investors and a significant loss of reputation in the industry. So those instances get covered in that category. In other regulatory violations, it is primarily driven towards benami transactions, where in UK's terms, it is similar to that of the declaration of beneficial ownership, where the primary owner may be different from the ownership that is exhibited in this in the regulatory records. Now, moving a little forward, we're going to speak broadly about some of the examples relating to each of this. We spoke about market manipulation, where it also involves aspects of insider trading, where corporations or representatives of the corporations who have access to financial information mistrade based on sensitive financial information they get during the course of their engagement with the company. In money laundering, there is active action that's been investigated in terms of by the banking channel in terms of how the money is moved and how the banking channel is misused for the purpose of converting the black money into white money, primarily the laundering base. In anti-corruption, there have been multiple instances of anti-corruption violations stemming from India, and those violations are relatable directly to third-party transactions where there are intermediary used for the purpose of moving funds to a public official for obtaining or retaining business interests. Anti-competition, as we rightly spoke, it is about the market share or the monopolization that impacts the market. We also briefly spoke about tax violations, focusing on the falsification of books and records. There are active engagements that the market is also taking and the regulators are taking, where they are more concerned about understanding if the tax reporting are based on actual books or there are parallel books and records. And the tax regulator has been active in conducting investigations to gather evidences around them. There are also parallel transactions of beneficial ownership related issues, which is what comes under the other violation, like we briefly spoke. The regulatory environment in India is also changing with international cooperation and increase in enforcement in domestic environment. And on the other side, private businesses in each of these aspects are also being more active in conducting compliance investigations in order to uphold their compliance culture and also drive transparency. As we move on to the next slide, we are going to touch upon some of the aspects that may be relevant from a what regulators are involved in what kind of compliance issue. For a compliance issue like market manipulation, Security Exchange Board of India, which is the market regulator, gets involved in it. And for a concern like anti-money laundering, the banking channel regulator, Central Bank of India, which is nothing but the Reserve Bank of India, gets involved. There are also investigations that are conducted by Economic Offences Wing and Central Bureau of Investigation. Both of this in some form will be part of the Serious Fraud Office in UK's terms. From an anti-corruption perspective, the regulators involved are primarily Central Vigilance Commission, which acts as the vigilant unit for the whole central and state governments, and you also have a parallel Lokpal bill, which also mandates investigation and prosecution of both individuals and the public officials. Anti-competition is handled by Competition Commission of India, while tax and other violations are handled by specific regulators who are Central Board of Direct Taxes and Central Board of Excise and Customs. With demonetization that happened recently, the government is taking up active steps in identifying tax violations. With Panama Papers, there is also active involvement of government in tracking down the global implications of the violations that have happened from India. Now, as we move on to the next slide, where we are getting into a section to speak about the overall evidence sources in India. When we started the presentation, we said we will focus on 4 key areas. First area being the areas of compliance investigation, which is what we looked at 6 prominent areas. And we also looked at the regulators who actually handle these areas. And the third portion that we were supposed to look at was evidence sources in India. When you're gathering evidences, what are the evidence sources that are available? The fourth thing is considerations that you need to take while conducting compliance investigations in India. As we come to this third section of exploring the evidence sources in India, we need to understand one broader theme. The broader theme in this is the whole of gathering evidence is depending on availability of evidence, extractability of evidence, and representability of evidence. Whatever be the nature of compliance investigation, the investigation is primarily around a policy violation, which is an internal compliance issue, or a regulatory violation, which implicates your market and also regulatory fines. Now, in both these circumstances, most important thing is to see what kind of sources of evidence exist and how are you able to identify those sources of evidence to recover the essential evidence to represent the culpability or the actual violation in question. Here we have actually plotted 5 categories of sources of evidence. The first being books and records. Books and records are nothing but your accounting records or other subsidiary records, which contains a lot of information about the transactions that the business has handled. Now, this may be relevant in multiple contexts. The idea if we are looking at it from a tax violation standpoint, there could be multiple parallels of books that are maintained by certain business entities. And if we look at it from a banking sector perspective, it may be relevant when they are doing anti-money laundering due diligences. The books and records that are represented to them may be different from what is provided to the register of companies. Registry records is the second category, where you are speaking about the source where annually companies are expected to submit their books, finalized financial statements or books to the regulator, and the submitted records becomes a source. Now, in litigation-related circumstances in compliance investigations, where you have limitation in access to those records, some of these records may be of help. Digital records or records that are maintained digitally, including your email communications, your office documents, your images, videos, as the case may be, these data has a lot of information or evidence that is relevant for a compliance investigation. The fourth is open source intelligence or public domain sources, where the whole country is moving towards digitization, and we see a significant proportion of urban population moving into completely online media. When they are moving into this online media, there's a lot of information about us that is available in public sources. If we have to go by preliminary estimates, if we look at people between 15 years of age to about 35 years of age, we see about in urban population about 60 to 70% of population are on social network. So urban population, 70% of population being on social network and being active is a significant information, and it's a lot of data that stays there. And these information, while not directly relatable to their work environment, has a lot of evidences, as we will see in the subsequent slides, for conducting investigations. There could be other sources of evidence in terms of market intelligence that may be also helpful while conducting investigations. With that said, we will get into some of these specific areas to understand what kind of sources of evidence exist and how those evidences are helpful in an investigation environment. The first of such thing that we are looking at is what kind of evidences do we gather from books and records related investigation. So there are a couple of examples that I would like to cite. Now, in terms of when we are looking at if we are doing an investigation on anti-corruption, you will have a lot of draft agreements and arrangements that may be there as part of books and records, or you may have a lot of invoices which have been falsified. Now, understanding the sources of these documents and reviewing these documents will give you an idea of how they have been represented in the books. So that is the primary source. I would like to cite one of the examples. In one of the investigations that we were doing, the company, the executives of the company had obtained, had opened the bank accounts of their third-party subcontractors on their behalf and were operating the bank accounts on their behalf. So what basically happened was the company had to pay the subcontractors. The company would pay to the subcontractors to the bank accounts of subcontractors, which is maintained by the company executives. And the company executives will in turn withdraw the money from the bank accounts, a portion of that money, not the whole money, a portion of the money from the bank accounts, and then pay it back to the subcontractors. So in this way, they were actually accumulating funds by falsifying the books. What was paid to the subcontractor was not what was actually paid into the bank account of the subcontractor, which was maintained by the company officials. So these kind of instances do happen, and sometimes looking at the books and records, examining the books and records, inquiring about it helps in understanding specific evidences that may be there. You may also have similar evidences coming up from purchase order or sales orders. In another case, what we noticed was there was a portion of facilitation payment that was combined as part of the unit rate in a infrastructure construction contract. So when it combined, so for a particular activity, for a civil activity or building a pipeline to a particular height, you will have certain line item of charges. These line item of charges have a unit rate attached to it. So for so many square meters, this is the rate per square meter. this has been consistent across period. When we looked at the overall trend of the rates across period, we noticed that there was not much of significant change in rates across periods for this particular activity. But in a particular contract, this rate was much different. When we inquired about it, we were told that there are certain locational differences and the parties were not ready to provide it at that level and all. When we were able to correlate and corroborate these information with other forms of evidences, specifically digital forensic evidences, we realized that a portion of the cost is contributed. The increase in cost is contributed by a facilitation payment that was intended to be paid to a public official. So these kind of information can also give you a lot of evidence while conducting investigations. Now, as we move on to the next segment, we are exploring what kind of evidences do exist in digital records. As a whole, from a digital record standpoint, there are multiple sources of evidences. There could be emails, there could be activities of using a thumb drive or a USB. There could be information of what contents were downloaded. There could be access logs or event logs or personal identity information that may be there. So how can this be helpful in a compliance investigation? In a compliance investigation, there could be information of how the employee or a particular third party having access to information of someone else. For example, an employee having access to information of a subcontractor becomes a particular red flag. If the employee has a letterhead or certain documents, including registration documents or tax documents of the subcontractor. Those are all unusual content which normally a business may not have access to beyond its minimal due diligence related documentation. So those red flags become a source of evidence and it can help in taking the investigation forward. We could also have a number of communications, either in nature of chat logs or emails. We have also seen in the past where as part of internal chat network, the employees of the organization do chat about how to stash the funds or how to create a secret fund that can be used for a payment to a public official or intended to a public official through an intermediary. So these communications help us understand the way the transactions are represented and the facts around it. Such interventions are relevant in examining the whole scheme of events and to understand them better. Similarly, similar to information that is available in a desktop or laptop, there are opportunities of gathering such evidences from mobile devices also. Mobile devices these days carry a lot of information which includes information relating to social media access, to chat logs, to communications and text history. So this information is extractable depending on whether the asset in question, which is the mobile phone, is owned by the entity or not. For example, if a company wants to conduct an investigation, depending on how their internal policies are structured, they may want to look at the hard disk or laptop or desktop that is used by the identified employee or the suspect employee, and they may also consider examining the mobile phone of the employee. But there is something that one needs to understand. In both these circumstances, the essence that somebody needs to keep in mind is the asset that we are speaking about, both in nature of the laptop or in nature of mobile phone, has to be owned by the company for them to have access to these assets to conduct investigation. And Second thing is their policy should be aligned in a manner so that they are able to seek access and conduct the investigation. It is possible that the company allows extended use for personal matters as part of their policy. If there is an extended use, which is unusual, in normal circumstances it's only reasonable use. If it is an extended use, or if the device is a BYOD kind of a device, wherein it bring your own device kind of a model, in those circumstances, the company has to really evaluate their policy and their ability to examine these assets to gather evidence in compliance investigations. Like I was saying, a mobile phone can also throw up a lot of evidences in nature of social media information or call or text history. The text history, it becomes more convenient for people to text between each other. So whatever issue that we spoke or evidence we spoke while we were speaking about chat logs is applicable to a call and text history. A text exchange between two individuals within the company or with with a suspected outsider could also be a prominent evidence for the purpose of the review. I suggest the organizations or the investigators to evaluate the rights and liabilities around conducting or examining the evidences or examining these devices based on their policy prior to getting into them. With that, we move on to the next prominent segment or source of evidence, which is evidences from public domain sources. With e-governance, there is a lot of information that is available in the public media, and these informations include informations relating to your electoral rolls, information relating to your blogs, B2B sites which contains contact information, professional networking sites, and also social media sites which contains your personal and social conversations. Some of these are helpful in gathering evidence. So I would like to give an example of one of the circumstances wherein we were conducting an anti-bribery corruption investigation. In that investigation, we were doing a public domain search about a particular third party who is suspected to have acted as a licensing agent for obtaining a particular contract. And when we had an employee who was responsible for getting that license, and we had an identified third party who was suspected to have licensed in getting that license. In that particular case, when we did a public domain search, we identified an obituary column. The obituary column contained a photograph and name of the person, and along with that, it had details of the family members. And the details of family members included two people's name. One, the name of the employee as the relative, and the name of the third party as the relative, and the name of the regulator who had signed that license as a relator. So this gives a complete picture that with one obituary column that you find somewhere in a public domain, you are able to conclude an investigation or at least get forward in an investigation, and this critical evidence becomes a core for you to determine if there was a influence or possible influence. And this indicator helps you in inquiring on was there an undisclosed relationship between the employee third party and the public official, and whether that had an influence on getting the licenses. So that becomes relevant. Another thing that also is relevant is sometimes it has helped in investigations is electoral rolls. In India, thanks to elections that happens more frequently than we expect, we do have a record of electoral list, and these lists contain details of age, their father or mother, their relationship status, and their address. This information can be correlated for a number of conflict of interest reviews or even AML reviews. In AML reviews, if you are finding multiple people who are originating and the funds are getting moved from multiple accounts maintained by people in the same house to a different location, that actually gives you an indicator. And if that is part of a SAR report, it is worth investigating in this channel. Recently, one of the banks had a major challenge, which is Bank of Baroda, had a major challenge with regard to AML issues, and their investigation, as reported in the media, represent that a number of fake accounts or accounts with fake addresses, fake details were created for them to channelize funds. Now, while you're conducting this investigation, you will be in a position to correlate whether the addresses are valid, and you're able to also validate whether the people who are being represented in electoral rolls are getting are coming in along in the database that is maintained by the bankers. So this information may be helpful, and one has to look at how they are able to utilize this information in a particular investigation. While all this is said, we will move on to one of the other critical sections of how these investigations evolve. Like I said earlier, now there could be, when we are looking at investigations, these investigations could be internal compliance investigations or investigations driven by regulations. Now, all investigations, all compliance investigations may be regulation driven, but they may not be a regulator driven, which means it may not be a government initiated or regulator initiated investigation. It could also be an internal investigation. Now, the focus of internal investigation is to look at what are the internal concerns and also to evaluate how to prevent losses or how to prevent the compliance failures. While the focus of external or regulatory investigations are towards definitive legal course of investigation handling. In internal investigation, in India, corporations do take a conservative view of reporting to the regulator. There are not many cases that we see as a trend where the companies do go forward to report to the regulator. Normally, they consider that as a commercial issue and they conclude the investigation, terminate the employee, or take a disciplinary action against the employee or the third party, and then take things forward. There are very less number of cases that we see where the legal action is taken at a formal level. Reporting to regulators is also an essential thing. With the change in Companies Act and change in other regulatory regulations around the companies, there is an increased necessity to report to the government. That reporting is maturing, and the government is also looking at how to bring in more transparency in reporting of prominent internal violation that has an impact to the external world. When I say external world, it could be investors, it could be consumers, or it could be market as such. So that said, it is essential for organization to be aware of the implications of both internal investigations and regulatory investigations, and also consider an appropriate balanced approach in conducting investigations and also reporting it to regulators, as reporting to regulators is going to become a mandate, if not now, sooner from now. Already we see signs of necessity to report to regulators coming up in some of the regulatory environments, and it is expected to move forward. With this, we come to the last section of our discussion, which is on what are the aspects that one has to consider while conducting a investigation in India, primarily a compliance investigation in India. Now, there are three broader aspects one should be careful about. The first being, how do you handle employees in a certain environment? So when we say employees, so there are two categories that we could broadly put it into. People who are employees, people who are classified as workmen or labor. Indian labor regulations currently consider employees who do not have a direct reporting or who do not have people reporting to them as workmen for the purpose of compliance violations or for the purpose of the labor regulations. So in that context, an employee can be disciplined or a specific disciplinary action can be initiated against an employee in its natural course without requirement to consider issues arising from labor regulations, provided he has people reporting into him. And it is also essential for somebody to give sufficient notice to the subjects. Here, there is a process that is laid down for conducting investigation internally, and it has a standard process for providing a show cause and also notice for the show cause. While companies may adopt their own approaches around it, there should be a disciplined approach towards handling such issues, and there should be consistency that should be adopted in giving notice to the readers of the show cause. So which could be your witness and which could also be the show cause that is given to a subject. It is also essential to document minutes and conclusion more precisely. We have seen a couple of instances in the recent past where in sexual harassment investigations, the investigative conclusions are not so specific, and hence the court has ruled them as inadequate. So while this is not necessarily in the ambit of compliance investigations, this particular fact is applicable in compliance investigation environment also. As we come to the second part, in obtaining and retaining evidences, there are two factors that one may need to take care of: privacy and personally identifiable information. Now, the regulations in India for privacy is evolving. It has not reached to the stage that we see in Western world, but still there are limitations in looking at the examining issues while conducting investigations, or while somebody is looking at evidences from the standpoint of a particular compliance violation. Now, there may be a number of personally identifiable information as part of a digital asset that has been taken for examination. It is a general best practice to eliminate those personally identifiable info for the company to gather evidences from that. If not, it may become a challenge at a later point in time because of either domestic regulations or because of international regulations, as the case may be. Because the companies are more and more global, the opportunity for international regulation impacting this is high. Then we are speaking about the legal limitations in conducting investigation, which includes you cannot take an uninformed oral evidence, or you cannot do a recording of an interview without information or consent from the subject. So these instances are something that somebody should be careful about. The third part is custodial investigations. While corporations do have internal teams in conducting investigations, it is necessary to allow or treat the subject with respect, because it is possible that they have slipped in a particular issue, and the human nature of treating them well is necessary while conducting investigations, because that may lead up to a violation and a serious consequences from a regulatory standpoint if the subject is not provided basic necessities, or the interviewers are constraining or threatening the subject in this whole scheme. With that said, we come to the end of the investigation-related presentation, and our overall scheme is to understand the environment one needs to be aware of while conducting compliance investigation in India. I summarize this as 5 to 6 points. The first thing is compliance investigations in India is evolving, and the enforcements are also evolving. Out of 6 prominent compliance issues that we see, 3 of them are very active, like anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, and competition commission or tax-related violation. Demonetization that occurred in mid of November has had a significant impact in contributing to investigations around tax compliances. More evidences are possible from digital sources with digitization, and also e-governance that has come up in a big way in India. While regulators are maturing, one should be very, very careful in handling certain sensitive issues like the ones that we see on the screen, and be very careful about not crossing the line and ensuring that we are able to get adequate evidences for us to take the investigation forward and conclude them. So with this, I just leave it to the organizers to take this forward, and thanks a lot for listening to this webcast, and I hope you had a lot of insightful information from this webcast. Over to you, the organizers.
Thank you, Sundar. So before we finish, I actually have a few questions for you. So we'll make a start with those now. The first one is, how can an electoral list help in an investigation?
Like I said, electoral list has information about somebody's name, their relationship status. When I say relationship status, the relationship of in terms of their father, mother of whom, or their wife of whom, that information is available, and also it has details of their age. Now, this information is publicly available information. While once somebody is conducting an investigation with reference to a conflict of interest or an issue relating to anti-corruption, they would be in a position to examine this data to see what information is correlatable with that. For instance, in one of the cases, we noticed that the regulator, or let's say the public official who was providing an approval for a particular license was also operating from the same building as the employee who was licensing with the public official to get that license. So these information, depending on the nature of the case, may become relevant in an investigation. In this particular case, it was relevant because the concern was that the employee influenced the public official in obtaining the license, and it also specifically mentioned that they both live in the same place. We were able to gather evidence from a prominent public source to establish this.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what points would you say are to be considered while conducting an anti-corruption investigation?
Sorry, I'm missing it.
What points are to be considered while conducting an anti-corruption investigation? what are the main points to be considered?
So while conducting anti-corruption investigation, there are three things one should be careful about. The first primary thing is about what kind of internal evidences that exist in terms of documentation. This could be in terms of communication or documentation. Once you look at the communication or documentation, you know what is the proportion of funds or what is the value of funds that is moving out for a purpose other than what is defined. Second is understanding from interviewing the employees to understand from them the purpose of these exceptions. For example, in a compliance investigation, you may get across a scenario where you are able to gather evidence of employees discussing about generating cash or creating cash/funds for the purpose of facilitation payments. So those communication, you need to first inquire the employees on the purpose of the communication, the validity around it, and the facts around it. That's the second part. Then the third part is to understand who are the other players involved. The players involved in this could be the third parties who act as intermediaries, or other people who may not necessarily be third parties. In a particular case, a personal driver of a senior management representative was the one who was handing over cash to a public official. Now, this guy is not part of the system, but that third party can also be of help in providing vital information relating to the investigation. These are the three pieces one needs to consider. One is gathering evidences internally from multiple sources, interviewing employees to understand facts, and third is to speak with relevant third party to gather the last mile evidence.
What actions have been taken by the government in the past year on these type of investigations?
So the government has been pretty active in the past 1 year, where the government has brought in newer regulations. Demonetization was one of the strongest act that the government has taken to prevent black money, and they've also gone ahead in looking at Binami Act. Binami Act is primarily declaring the beneficial owner. So these two acts have been very prominent, and that has triggered a lot of investigations parallelly. And these investigations are relating to AML violations, tax violations, and other reporting violations. So with these two things, I think, in my view, these two are the prominent efforts that the government has taken, which is having a larger impact across the compliance scenario.
And the next question we have here is, what are the regulatory reporting of fraud under the Companies Act?
The regulatory reporting under the Companies Act requires companies to report, the listed companies, to report frauds over a crore of Indian rupees. If the value of fraud was above a crore of Indian rupees, there is a requirement for the auditor to examine them and the company to report them. In case the company, the auditor feels that the senior management has an involvement in that particular fraud, they are expected to report to the central government. This is applicable from the previous year, which is March 2016. We need to see how the auditors are taking up this and how the reporting mechanism matures in the current year.
Right. So I think we have time for two more questions. So what other aspects to be considered while issuing show cause notice to a subject in a compliance investigation?
When we are issuing show cause notice, one should be really specific about whom it is addressed to, their local address in as per the records that the company maintains, the specific issue of concern, and what you expect the employee to answer about. These four things are very, very critical. It is also critical. The second point of address is very critical because many a times the employee may have shifted from one location to another location. They may or may not have updated the internal records. If the internal records are not updated, then the notice that is issued becomes ineffective. Nowadays, companies have started process of sending both registered post and also a signed scanned document as part of the email, so that the communication reaches the employee. The nature of concern and how it violates the company's code or business process is something that needs to be absolutely clear, and what the company expects when the company wants the employee to respond on, what they want the employee to respond on, both needs to be specifically spelled out in a show cause notice.
And the last question I have is, are there any guidelines on adequate procedures in a compliance investigation?
Unfortunately, in Indian context, we do not have something more specific like an adequate procedure guideline. But the thumb rule is that you need to have a demonstrable evidence to prove or disprove, to substantiate or not substantiate a particular issue of concern. And you need to adopt measures which are within the legal purview for it to be represented in the court of law. Somebody needs to follow these two thumb rules of gathering evidences which are proving or disproving a particular issue in concern, and also ensuring that the approaches adopted are within the lines of the reporting obligations and also the general principles of law. So these two things will be the basic guideline, and in my view, these two would be best said as an adequate procedure approach.
Thank you, Sundar, for that presentation today. Very thorough, and I'm sure our audience will find it very useful. So yeah, thank you, and thank you everyone for listening in.
Thank you, Becky. I hope everybody enjoyed these the contents in the slide and you're able to relate to it, and I hope you are able to use these references in your compliance investigations that you may be doing. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.